right. What an amazing introduction. I didn't know she was going to say that. It's very kind. My name is Bill Durrant, and as Jen mentioned, I work in marketing, and specifically within marketing, within media and advertising. And I've spent the better part of the last 18 years working in beverage, across all of the different categories in beverage, and working with predominantly consumer-facing brands. So what I'd like us to do for this session is to put on, or perhaps more appropriately, keep on, our marketers' caps and think about the number one question that I try to answer every single day, which is how do brands grow? And as we think about that question, I think about that question in the context of the conversations that I'm having every single day with brands in the beverage space. And there are three questions that come up most often from those brands. And those are the questions that we're going to try to answer today, or we're going to begin to answer today. What new technologies are consumers really using? How can I understand the next generation of adults or consumers? And what are the key trends that we're seeing in coffee and beverage? To do that, we've split things up into three sections over the next 15 minutes or so. And the first one is a little game that I like to call hope or hype. And really what it's designed to answer is, with consumer technology changing at such a rapid pace and happening so quickly, what are the new consumer technologies that give us a lot of hope for the future, that consumers are gravitating towards and are giving us the opportunity to connect with them, and which ones are just hype and we can ignore? And perhaps more importantly, there's a key question that emerges from doing that exercise that I think will be pretty apparent pretty quickly on. The second question is, who is that next generation of consumers? And this is a generation that we're very fortunate. We just completed 6 months of research against 1,300 adults, really trying to understand Generation Zennial, which is the next generation that we need to know. These are the young adults that are tastemakers in culture, and also now are young adults with disposable income who have entered the workforce. They're the next set of consumers, even if they'd hate to be called that word. And then finally, we'll do a little bit of a deep dive into three trends that we're seeing in the coffee and beverage space on our side of the business. Okay, so first up, we're gonna play our game. It's not a super fun game, but hopefully it's enlightening nonetheless. And I call it hope or hype. Because we, as marketers, and particularly folks who work in the media and advertising space, are bombarded by new technologies and changes in existing technologies literally every single day. So what we want to think about is, are these technologies that are worthy of pursuing as brand marketers? Are these technologies that are worthy of pursuing as somebody trying to grow a brand, a coffee brand, a beverage brand? Or are these just hype right now and not necessarily the best place to invest our dollars and time? Okay, so first up, you knew that there was no way you were going to get through a marketing presentation in 2023 without talking about ChatGPT, right? We had to assume this was happening, so I figured let's get it out of the way early. This is generative AI. So ChatGPT falls under the family of generative AI. And what generative AI allows us to do is to generate new ideas, concepts, imagery, copy, and test those out in ways that we've already been doing from a media and advertising standpoint. And so for brands, there's great hope. So this falls into the category of hope. And I'll also talk a little bit about how consumers are going to be utilizing things like ChatGPT in the future as well. But when we think about generative AI, we now have the opportunity to create hundreds, if not thousands, or tens of thousands of new pieces of copy, of new taglines. On the other side, we're able to create hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of new pieces of imagery, and then combine the two and pull the two together and see how they collaborate and combine. Which of these combinations now, these hundreds of thousands of combinations, actually generate the most sales response and generate the most response from consumers? That's a fantastic way to incorporate generative AI into the work that we're doing as marketers. But what's also really interesting is how consumers are going to be using it as well. So we're all very accustomed to the standard Google or Bing search query where we type in maybe a question, usually just a bunch of keywords of what we're trying to understand, and we get a bunch of results back. If anyone here has used ChatGPT, you know that that experience is very different, and it's supported by Microsoft, which is a distant second, but the second largest provider of search inventory in the world. What we're now going to be doing is instead of simply having a query happen at the top of the search page, we're actually going to be having a conversation with the artificial intelligence and using it to answer questions for us and to have a dialogue with us that helps us refine the answers that we're looking for. That's a very different way of approaching something like search, which was pretty consistent over the last 15 years in terms of how it was utilized. So consumers are using it, and now brands are using generative AI in a way that's never been done. Great hope for the future. Sorry, Mark. Mark Zuckerberg laid out this grand vision for the metaverse, and I think this is a great example of what we would consider to be hype. Mark Zuckerberg laid out this vision of the metaverse of people socializing and gathering and collecting in avatar format, in cartoonish format online. And I think what was missing from this and this vision was there was no true consumer utility or consumer benefit in most use cases. It was simply if we build it, they will come. And it wasn't interesting enough for people to do that. But we can contrast that with other applications of the metaverse. So perhaps you or your children play Fortnite or Roblox. Are those on in your house, like mine? Those are other applications of the metaverse that are actually filled with hope because they are now billion-dollar enterprises. They are providing value to consumers in the form of entertainment and game playing. So when we think about the metaverse, what we're thinking about is which side of the metaverse? Is it providing a consumer utility, a consumer function? If so, it's an area that we can explore participating in, and that's how we're advising brands right now. Let's talk about VR. So I did all these searches, sexy VR, attractive VR, all these different searches, and I got a lot of results back that have nothing to do with this presentation. But this was the sexiest image that I could come up with for VR. This was it. This is kind of the pinnacle in 2023 for VR. And I think what we're seeing here is something that's not a great user experience from a hardware standpoint. And so we're finding it's a struggle to really scale up VR, even though the actual experience itself does provide a lot of consumer utility and benefit, especially for brands who are more entertainment focused. So when we think about this, it's about the accessibility as much as it is about the consumer utility and the consumer benefit that leads us to say that VR is still, unfortunately, falling under the category of hype. But let's contrast that. Let's contrast that with AR, or augmented reality. AR fills us with a great amount of hope. And the reason why is that there's a massive consumer utility. When I can pull my phone out of my pocket, open up the IKEA app in my home, and see exactly how that new IKEA chair is going to look in my house, that's a huge consumer benefit. That's a huge benefit to me, and there's a huge utility. And also think about what I did. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. We're all sitting here with our phones in our pocket or in our lap. And so the hardware is already built in for AR. Same if I was in Japan, for instance, and I pulled my phone up to a busy street where I didn't understand what was going on. I was feeling a little disoriented after my flight. And I had the opportunity to start to see which businesses are down that street. What are their average reviews? What do they do? Are they even open right now or not? In a language native to me. Huge consumer benefit and huge benefit for AR. And that's what you're seeing is really the through line. Since we only have the time to get through 4 of these, the through line is what is the consumer utility and benefit? And secondarily, what is the accessibility of that from a hardware standpoint? That's how we're thinking about new technology and how we advise brands. So let's shift gears a little bit. Let's talk about the next generation of consumers, and I mentioned earlier they would absolutely hate to be called that, so hopefully there's no one here under the age of 29, which is what we call Generation Zennials. Zennials, of course, being a portmanteau of Gen Z and the millennial generation, which a lot of us as marketers, I think, finally feel like we have a pretty good understanding about after 10 years of total obsession. And as we think about who this generation is and why they're so important, this is the generation that's not only entering the workforce and now has disposable income, they're making choices and decisions and creating brand loyalties that will last a lifetime. They're not quite millennials, and they're not quite Gen Z. And it's important to distinguish that this is really a Goldilocks generation. Born between 1995 and 2000, although I would say probably born closer to 95 to 2003. We're talking about 20 to 28-year-olds, generally speaking. This is a generation that grew up in a digital-first world, in a sustainability and climate change conscious world. But how that actually expresses is really interesting. And so in the research that we ran in surveying all of these different consumers, one of the first things we found was this duality. They are digital natives with an analog heart. And what we mean by that is they're just as likely to be spending more time with media that's digital in nature or video games than millennials, but they're also more likely to be spending more time with things like AM/FM radio, which really surprised us. And we found is that they were born before an era that was filled with the ubiquity of social media and smartphones. So they still kind of have a connection and a tether back to a world that was digitizing, but whose ubiquity hadn't quite taken place yet. So when we think about how to advise brands on reaching this generation, it's truly an omni-channel experience. We've got a picture here of Coachella, which is happening again this weekend. And that's the type of place where reaching Generation Zennial in real life and creating a sensory experience is incredibly critical. We also know how important climate change is to them. I believe it's over 3/4 of them think it's the most important issue happening today. I believe it's 77%. And we also saw another really interesting duality. Sustainability, of course, is important. It's a really important issue in this room, too. As we think about sustainability, we saw that they were actually 50% more likely than the millennials before them to switch brands solely based on their record of sustainability. That was really surprising. That's pretty high. But less than 10% of them actually expected to do that over the next 6 to 12 months. So something to think about as well. There is a pragmatism to their idealism. There is a balance of what the world should be and the decisions and choices that they're actively making on a daily or weekly basis. And so what we know about them too is how important it is to show and tell your brand's values, your sustainability, your supply chain, and so forth. But make sure that it's authentic, because this is a generation that will call you out if not. And what I think I personally love the most in understanding Generation Zennial a little bit better is how future-focused they were. Not surprising that they're saving up to buy a home in greater numbers than any other generation based on their age and stage. Not surprising that they're saving up for their education based on where they are age-wise. But what I love to see was that 18% of Generation Zennial said that they're saving up to start a business. It's almost 1 in 5 of this generation starting a business and actively taking steps towards that. And so what we see is that if the millennial generation brought a huge surge to entrepreneurialism, Generation Zennial is going to take that and accelerate it even further. So this is a future-focused generation, and they say all of this even despite the survey taking place during the worst inflation over the last 40 years, during the economic uncertainty that we're all kind of feeling and facing. And that's a really critical distinction to make, is that these young adults are planting the seeds for the rest of their life, and they're not going to let anything get in their way. Okay. So the last section we'll talk about today is some of the things that we're seeing in the beverage industry, just kind of being active participants. 3 kind of top-level learnings, and we'll get a little bit more high-level and strategic as we go. The first is what we see with beverage hacking. Probably not a surprise to a lot of people in this room So we work with Premier Protein. It's $1 billion a year in annual sales protein drink. And what we found was that consumers were organically doing what we call beverage hacking. Consumers were actively taking their Premier Protein and combining it with their morning coffee. And then we started to look around and dig around with some of the other beverage brands that we work with. And what we found is that people are combining not just products and not just flavors, but actual product functions. And they're creating these kind of superhuman Frankenstein drinks that are frankly quite compelling. If you've ever tried a Premier Protein with your morning coffee, it's actually quite good. So for us, one of the most important things that we want to understand is what is this type of behavior and what can our brands learn from it? It's probably more helpful from a product development standpoint than it is from a media and advertising standpoint. But it's something and the type of conversation that we like to be having with our brands is to understand what's happening organically and how we can leverage that. The second is this idea of experience, and experience wins. We talked about this a moment ago with Generation Zennial. If you're a brand like Doritos, we're going to use Doritos, we're not going to pick on them, they're doing interesting things. If you're a brand like Doritos, it's very easy for you to show up to Coachella this weekend or to go to South by Southwest in March and start handing out bags of Doritos. You get it into people's hands, you get it into people's mouths, and you do it at an event that's cool, and so they're going to have a more positive association of your brand. That's great. That's simple and easy. But that's not what Doritos is doing. And they're a great example of how experience wins. They're creating essentially a Doritos house at South by Southwest. They're creating a multi-sensory brand experience. They're going deeper than just hand me the bag of chips or hand me the chips. And what we found is that the most successful brands right now are utilizing this blend of digital-first communications in their marketing and advertising, along with in real life experiences to create a more complete relationship with consumers. And so for us, it's a question of actually tasting the product or even using it as a garnish here for upscale, more premiumized foods that are in this experience. Turns out you can't just eat Doritos there for 6 hours straight, which is why I didn't go. But it's also about this concept of a value exchange. You show up in person, you have this experience in person, you're much more likely to share your email address or your phone for SMS marketing and to truly create a two-way type of marketing relationship, an opt-in relationship with the consumers and the people who experience that. You know, that type of execution is probably reserved a little bit more for influencers, but we're seeing brands do this at scale, going around at all different types of events. So what is that multi-sensory experience that you can create? I don't think it's going to be the Doritos chip-shaped kaleidoscopic tunnel that you walk down that smells like barbecue sauce, if I understand it correctly. But what is the experience that your brand stands for and wants to create in the world? And then the final piece that we've seen is that brands weather storms. Why is this important? This is the brand that I really love. It's actually the opposite of coffee. It's kava. But what we found is that brands weather storms. This idea of I can just run my advertising on Facebook and Google and my brand will keep growing. Well, that runs out after a certain point. And that certain point is less than ever before. The idea of growth hacking and performance marketing to grow a brand beyond a certain point is dead, dying, or evolving rapidly. What we also know is that we're in a period of economic uncertainty. I feel like we've all been waiting for a recession for the last 6 to 9 months. And we know that when recessions happen, based on past data, that brands that have actually created a connection with their consumer, brands that have actually built a brand, instead of simply saying, buy now, shop now, 10% off, $20 off, over and over and over again in the totality of their communication with a consumer. Brands that actually create a brand relationship are the ones that weather those storms the best. So we went into this session with 3 good questions. And I think we're coming out with 3 even better questions. Number 1, ask yourself in everything that you do, what consumer benefit does this provide? Whether that's the technology that you choose to use, or it's the messaging that you share, the product packaging, or even your formulation. What is the product benefit? What is the consumer benefit to everything that we're doing as a marketing organization? Number two, how am I connecting with Generation Zennials? This is not just a hypothetical exercise. They're not the next generation. They're here today, and they are actively spending money and making brand decisions that will last them for decades. And finally, what experiences am I creating that bring my brand's unique values to life? This is perhaps the most important question that we can ask to create that true omni-channel experience that stretches across the totality of a consumer's lifestyle. Thank you.
Bill, if you want to have a seat, we're going to ask you some questions. I have so many questions, actually.
Hit me.
Trying to keep track of them all. So first, you're talking about an omni-channel experience, but we're also referencing lots of really big brands. I'd say most of the businesses who are here attending RICO don't have the deep pockets that Doritos have. So how might you sort of build, or from your work, how do you think about maybe they should be building that kind of experience, or what opportunities do they have to do that when you can't build a house? Yeah,
it's a great question. A lot of the brands that we work with don't necessarily have large budgets either. And I think for them, the ones that have been most successful are the ones that have found what are the passion points for my audience, and then what are the events that are taking place with some kind of scale, perhaps some kind of geography that's local to me, or national if I'm a national brand. And then they're integrating into those events. And they're doing that in a way that's much more efficient. And the first brand that we ever worked with was Cliff Bar. And Cliff Bar were masters at this, at what they called field marketing. And they would find all the different local events for each of their geographies and regions. And they didn't have to invest a ton of money, but they created these little experiences inside local races for all the different endurance sports. And they built out these experiences where product trial was a part of it. And that's how they ultimately grew to become the billion-dollar-plus brand that they are today.
I also want to talk to you a little bit about consumer research, because I think there's a lot of interest in being able to do it, but not necessarily either you need a budget, or is there anything that maybe some people can take away from this in terms of how to sort of leverage consumer research or access it in the general space?
It's a tricky question. The one thing that we were doing at one point was we were utilizing what was called Google surveys. Yeah. We haven't found a replacement for that since it went away, unfortunately. What we do know is that there are a lot of organizations that you may already be partnered with from a marketing standpoint that may have access to what we call syndicated research. And so that's research that's done across a wide swath of consumers and allows us to understand people's mindsets better, people's product usage better, especially in the coffee industry. There's a lot of research from places like MRI, Simmons, even ComScore, if we're trying to understand where they are behaving and how they're behaving digitally. So if you have partners in the marketing space, ask them questions. Do you pay for MRI and Simmons? Can I understand? Can you do some runs for me, as we call it in the biz? Can you do some runs for me to help me understand the coffee consumer a little bit better? Those are the types of things that we're looking at. And then I've heard occasionally that there's significantly reduced pricing for lower revenue organizations, if you can prove that, with some of the research providers. So think about a research provider like Mintel, who does an excellent job doing deep dives into different industries. That's the kind of, I would say research hacking that we might want to look into, yeah.
I can see questions flooding in now from the audience, so we're going to dig into those, although I could literally have so many more questions. If specialty coffee has identified itself as being low tech, a lot of the trends that you were talking about, they're higher tech, but is there a low tech way to sort of build that brand authenticity?
Yeah, I mean, we believe in the power of in real life communication and going beyond what we talked about already around experience. We believe in the power of simple outdoor media. We believe in the power of, finding ways to create community. And that's not really an area where we're going to jump in and be your guide or your consultant. But how are we finding ways to create community is really one of the main questions that we're trying to ask, and that can happen in a very organic, low-tech way. One of the reasons why we talk about consumer technology in our field so much is because of the digitization of everything. But that doesn't mean that the in real life experience is not important. So for us, when we have a truly local campaign, it's what is that experience that we can create? How can we drive community around it? And if we want to think about it from an advertising perspective, let's be on the ground and let's actually be utilizing some of the media that's on the ground in local cities, that's actually out there in the physical world to do that. And then the other thing that I would say too is that the coffee experience is definitely low tech, but that doesn't mean that we can't use digital media to support it and to back it up. There's plenty of ways to do that are 100% authentic. We had this incredible experience that we did maybe 6 or 7 years ago right here in Portland, Seattle, and a few other cities. And it was all about the potential of human growth. And it wasn't interactive, but it was a very in-person experience. Yeah. And so for us, we found the greatest results were from utilizing digital advertising to drive people to what was a very physical, tangible, in-person experience. And we were able to do that much easier now in 2023 than any point in our history. You don't have to have a big fancy media agency to help you out.
You mentioned sort of that the growth mindset of advertising it's becoming much harder to do, that sort of paid growth. And so just sort of pivoting a little bit from that in terms of using advertising to pull people into a physical space, could you speak a little bit about strategies for organic growth versus that kind of paid advertising?
Sure. For us, I think we always look like heroes when a brand that we're working with has a strong sales presence and has a strong presence in terms of actually knowing what its values are, what it stands for, and who its specific audience is. Because at the end of the day, the most powerful marketing touch point, hands down, is word of mouth. No matter what category you look into, and I've seen this literally across 20 different food and beverage categories, every single time was word of mouth was the most important thing. And so I think really what brands are looking at is, I need to be able to tell an authentic story. I need to be able to support that with increased distribution. If that's appropriate for your business, increased distribution begets more sales, begets an advertising budget, which begets itself again. That's how you create that virtuous cycle. And so I think, I have several friends who have brands in the hot sauce space, yeah, which is super cool, even though I'm a total wimp when it comes to hot sauce. But the thing that transformed their business the most, number one, was having incredible product. But number two was hiring the right salesperson. And it can't be understated how important that is. So sort of a left field answer probably from where the question was coming from, but we like to think about the business as a totality. And when you're creating a brand organically, it's about putting it in front of as many people as possible in as cost-effective of a way as possible, and then utilizing tactics like media and advertising later to continue to create that virtuous cycle.
You said one of my favorite words in that answer, which is authenticity. And I see that we also have another question that is sort of about what it means to build that authentic connection. Mm-hmm. And authenticity is a construct, so sort of what does it mean to do that? I think someone is looking for a little bit of a case study. What does it mean to build that authentic connection?
Well, it's funny. It's sometimes authenticity is one of those things where you know when it's not there, and you know when it's there. It's something that can't be faked, essentially, which I guess is the whole point. But when it comes to authenticity, what we found is that brands who don't truly understand their values or truly understand where their supply chain is coming from and through, and don't necessarily have a leg to stand on when it comes to that regard, have a much harder time of creating an authentic relationship with consumers, because we don't know what we're talking about together. We don't know where our shared values are. So this idea of actually going through the exercise, these marketing exercises of putting down my brand values, understanding my supply chain and product as deeply as possible, what is its impact in the world, and then sharing that information and having honest dialogue about that with your consumer is incredibly powerful. And that's how authenticity is gained. Because you can do that as a 2-coffee shop burgeoning chain just as easily as you can do that as Starbucks.
I'm going to close with this question because I really love it, and I just want to thank whoever submitted it. Someone has asked about brand building for commodity coffee. So we've been talking a lot about sort of maybe more retail brands, but thinking about coffee origin country and thinking about sort of how you're branding that. What way would you go about?
Oh, every single time the answer is differentiation. What is unique about your product? And in a commodity class, your values can be what differentiate you and make you unique. It can be your product and where it's sourced from, if it's of exceptional quality. But if you're not thinking about your unique selling proposition, your unique value proposition to consumers, you're never going to get to where you need to be in that regard. So what differentiates my brand and what we're doing in this commoditized world is really the only way that you'll have a foot in the door, so to speak, to communicate with people. You'll find that otherwise it just comes down to being as attention-grabbing and flashy as possible, which just doesn't have the substance to support a brand long-term, unless you're Liquid Death. Those guys are amazing. I used to work with them. They're incredible, and they're doing an incredible job. But it shows you the power of marketing in a commoditized industry, of spring water. Calling it Liquid Death and just going all out for 5 years, and suddenly they're worth over $700 million.
Well, Bill, it has been a real pleasure to have you here with us. Thank you so much for sharing all of that information and kind of giving us lots of things to think about. Really appreciate your time here.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it.